Welcome back to the Black Carnivore podcast, and I am really excited to introduce today's guest all the way from the UK. And we are, hours apart, but there is definitely a simpatico in terms of food and values and cooking. And so we're going to have a great conversation today. So, Jack, let's just dive right in. And I'd love to hear from you. Like, how did you hear about carnivore? Why did you do it? What did you do? What is your carnivore? And then, let's dive right into your amazing guide to cooking steak, which I think, so many people in our generation need. I'm surprised at how well, and for myself, I had to teach myself how to cook, and I still, I would say I'm kind of iffy on the steaks. So with that, let's just dive right in.
That is so kind of you, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. So I got into carnivore, I think, the same way that a lot of us do, which is I kind of went through my 20s and 30s, sort of doing what I wanted, burning the candle at both ends, all that kind of stuff, and play hard, work hard, this kind of thing. And it hit my 40s and began, or my late 30s, and things began to fall apart a little bit. I had all kinds of problems with my gut. I wasn't feeling good. I was, waking up in the night with vomit on me and stuff. It seemed like I couldn't digest my food. I was getting, but basically what was diagnosed as IBS, but it was really quite debilitating. And I had tried all kinds of things and FODMAP, diets, exclusions, and this kind of thing. And I'd become very interested in nutrition through the course of trying to troubleshoot my own problems. And I was working on writing a book. In fact, what it turned out to be was two books, neither of which I was qualified to write. But the nutrition research part of this book had taken me to discover carnivore, had exposed me to carnivore. And I can't remember exactly what stage it was. At that stage, I think it was basically Sean Baker saying, just eat a damn steak, And so I thought this would be quite funny. I thought this is just stupid. These people are going to die, basically. I thought, well, I'll do it, and I'll do it for 2 weeks, and then I'll write about it, and it'll be quite funny, all the stupid things I tried to fix my problem. But of course, 3 days later, my gut problem was basically gone. And so then I'm faced with this issue. What am I going to do now? Because if I carry on doing this, then I'll die. So I'd begun to kind of dig a bit more in, and I discovered.
And isn't that funny that you getting well makes you fear you're going to die?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, you're like, okay, well, I fixed one problem, but with this other, fatal problem. So I discovered Paleo Medicina, and the PKD thing, and I thought, well, this looks credible because they've got a kind of clinic. It's not just some sort of nutter on Instagram saying stuff. So maybe what I'll do is I'll follow their protocol, and I'll go and see them, and then that way, it'll be safe, and I can justify it to my family, kind of thing. And actually, I didn't, I say that, but I didn't need to justify it too much to my wife, because she was so pleased that things had improved. It had been quite a hard time, for her, not just for me, but for her dealing with that with my kind of not being well. So she was thrilled, but and I said, look, I'm gonna carry on. So I consult Paleo Medicina, and I start following their protocol. And for people that don't know, the basic premise of the Paleo Medicina thing is that you eat very high fat, rare, sort of moderate to low protein, no carbs, no supplements, no plants really of any kind in the strictest sense, and you eat quite a small quantity of food. I mean, they start off by saying you should have 400 grams of food a day, so that's just under 1 pound of food a day. So and it's organs, a lot of meat and organs. So nose to tail, I did this, and I observed it religiously. I mean, I never ever deviated, but over the course, and I did it overall for about 30 months, so quite a good spell of time. But over that time, I had some problems. I was still getting quite severe attacks of inflammation. I was getting some cramping. I became cold a lot of the time, and I lost weight. And initially, I didn't have a lot of weight to lose, but it was fine kind of leaning out a little bit more. But I went from lean to very lean to kind of bodybuilder on competition day lean, but without the muscle, you know,
Yeah.
to basically falling off a cliff. And in the end, I was sort of weak and freezing, and my personal best had dropped and this kind of stuff. And basically with PKD, if you say to them, look, you know, I'm having problems, they'll say, you just stick on the diet, but you're probably eating too much. You should try cutting back your food a tiny bit more and see what happens. So of course, what happened was that I was basically starving to death. and I weighed myself. I had to weigh myself for something, and I was at 5'10". I was 55 kilos, and I was kind of shocked. So I thought, okay, look, this is not working. I need to add some food back, and I then began this process of kind of what is it that that it's that phrase where you kind of eat a load and basically it's the opposite of a diet. It's like a sort of
reverse dieting,
yeah,
I think,
right,
where people try to get their calories up.
Exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And around the same time, the kind of Sean Baker just eat a damn steak thing had sort of evolved into Paul Saladino and his kind of whole thing. You know, hey, you guys. You know, there was a little bit more stuff coming around, maybe the fact that deep ketosis, wasn't going to be so advantageous for everybody all the time. And when I began to introduce a little bit of carbohydrate, a little bit of fruit, a little bit of honey, suddenly my electrolytes kind of came good. I felt a lot better. And I gained a lot of weight, and I basically ate as much as I possibly could for a few months. And now I find myself in this position where I'm trying to kind of feel my way back to maybe taking just some of that weight off, but also not going back to the bad place. So exploring a little bit more around the periphery of carnivore, not being so strict, not so deeply ketosic all the time. And I'm not really criticizing Paleo Medicina, because I think, you know, if my consultations had been in person, you know, they probably would have said to me, hey, you're looking a bit skinny. Maybe you actually need to eat a bit more, you know. And they, to be fair, they always said, well, you know, if you're hungry, eat. But as we know, you don't get so hungry when you're eating that way. You're okay. But I think people do, you know, I think people in general in carnivore do need to be a little bit careful when you're fasting and it's a very low volume of food and you're, you know, very low insulin all the time. I don't think that suits everyone. And people will say, well, you know, it's just a nutrients thing. You need to make sure you get your organs. I don't think that's true. I've been through phases of eating a lot of organs and eating no organs. I haven't noticed a massive difference. When the guys came back from the Hadzabe'e recently, I did ask Eric Ednides, because I'd been thinking, how much liver, let's say, does a given person in one of these tribes get? Say you kill a baboon or whatever you kill, how much liver actually gets shared out between everybody? It can't be that much. And what he said was actually they observed this kind of kind of attitude to certain cuts of meat called a team, which is where only the elders and the senior hunters get that cut of meat at all. And the liver is very much included in that. Women, for example, are not even allowed to be there when liver is eaten. So if you're asking how much liver does a woman in one of these indigenous tribes get, the answer is none. So when we start, I think there is a great merit to looking at, how we've eaten in the past, how we're evolved to eat. But we have to maybe understand some of the nuances around that as well. So, yeah, and I mean, that's how where I've arrived is a place where I'm trying to kind of eat in that ancestral way broadly within the context of what we can actually do in a modern world. And for me, that does involve some carbohydrate, but I'm not by any means kind of back on as an omnivore. Most days I'm carnivore. I might have some honey every few days. I might have some berries, a carrot.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really interesting story, and I really appreciate your sharing that. It's interesting. I mean, some people need more energy than others. And, it sounds like the fat wasn't giving you enough calories. And you needed the combo of the, some carbs and fat to get your calories up and to slow, the burning of your fat, essentially.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think it was so much that I didn't get enough calories from the fat. I think if I'd eaten more, I could have got the calories I needed from the fat. But I do think there's a funny thing when your insulin is very, very low for a long period of time. I definitely had I couldn't resolve the cramping problem until I started including some small amount of carbohydrate. Even 5 grams, even a flat teaspoon of honey was enough.
Do you mean cramping as part of your like leg cramps, or do you mean
Yes.
like part of your IBS?
Yes. No, cramping leg cramps. Yeah, at night. I mean, agonizing,
Right,
and that went away. So clearly there was an electrolyte problem there,
Right.
But, then suddenly, so when I began to eat, I suddenly gained loads of weight. My body really drank it all in, but became much, much stronger, much, much warmer. I mean, we've been through the winter practically without the central heating, whereas, a year ago in the hot sun, I would be shivering in a weird way. It was really interesting. And all these kind of other sort of hormone things. And I would say to people, there is so much stuff online about what you should do. Don't lose sight of how you feel. If you are feeling cold and tired and whatever, it doesn't matter what the blood work tells you or what because you can explain these things away in 10 different ways. Oh, well, that's a little low because you've downregulated this. And, you hear this all the time. Go with how you feel. If you feel great. If you don't feel great, change something. And I'm not saying for a moment that I think we need plants from a nutrient standpoint. I actually don't think that. And I have tried reintroducing some, and it hasn't, certainly anything fibrous tends to cause me a problem again. But there is certainly room for just sitting slightly outside that carnivore thing, And
so what kind of things do you feel like you can eat that are not too fibrous and not, bothering your IBS?
Mostly fruit. I'd have said before that if I had fruit, it would be the worst thing, for that kind of stuff. But it's not. Fruit's been fine. I've had some blueberries and melon and stuff like that, and honey. If I'm cooking carrots for my daughter, I might have a few. I haven't done so well, strangely, with things like avocado, which I thought would be okay, and But so here's the interesting thing. I did track down a lot of the sources of problems that I was having while still on PKD to histamine, and that was an issue that I did not realize that I was having before. It may have surfaced while on carnivore. It may have been there before. It may have been a result of that sort of hormonal downgrading. But I found myself, my nose running when I ate. And what was happening was I was eating, here we have a lot of dry aged meat. So I would typically be eating dry aged beef and organ meats, which are quite high in histamine. And, it was just causing all kinds of problems for me. And since I've realized that and chased that down, it's been a lot easier to manage things. And I found that I can include certain other things a little bit more easily. But I don't really enjoy that. I'm not sitting there desperate to eat plants, to be honest with you. It's just sometimes it's fine. I tell you what's really useful is as a cook, being able to taste these things. And obviously, we're here to talk about steak primarily. I don't want to get into a discussion of my health background because that's exceptionally
well
boring.
Actually, I'm sorry, I did not introduce you at all, so no, I don't know that everyone knows, like, what do you do? What is your background with food?
Well, so I do something called RUSTON'S Boneyard, which came about when all these problems were going on. I'd stopped drinking and all those kinds of things that you do when you're trying to troubleshoot this stuff. And I had clients. I was working as a music producer, and I had clients coming up into the house. And normally we would go to the pub and have a few drinks and do that kind of stuff. But because that wasn't happening, I began to cook for people. And you know how much money you can spend on a night out and a few drinks. So I had a bit of money that I would spend on buying a nice steak and what have you. So I would cook for people. And one day, one of the guys I knew said, Jack, you know what I call this place? I call it RUSTON'S Boneyard, because there was, every time he came round, he'd end up sitting there holding this bone, So I thought to myself, I'd begun to move away from doing music professionally. I'd got a little bit sick of the music industry. And this idea came to maybe do the food a little bit more seriously. And through my own kind of experiences, I wanted to try to help people cook whole food meals, not necessarily carnivore, but certainly, you see a lot of families where maybe mum's got autoimmune disease and is eating carnivore, and dad's got type 2 diabetes and he needs to really cut back the carbs and the processed food. And the kids are fine, but they don't want them to go the same way. So how does this person who's lived on takeout and packaged food for 30 years, how does this person, this couple, how do they then create a meal that the whole family can eat? And I've been an avid cook for many, many years, and not professionally. I mean, I've got some sort of minor food qualifications, safety qualifications and stuff like that. But I didn't come from a chef background. I came from a background as a cook, which is quite a different thing. Chefs, as a chef, it's all about the consistency of what you do and how am I gonna make 30 plates of food this evening. Whereas, as a cook, all you need to just focus on making that one thing, and it's that food for the family. How does that fit into your life? And so I started just the usual social media stuff, RUSTON'S Boneyard, around that idea. And in that process, I began to write a book, taking some of the material from the previous book that I wasn't qualified to write, and it kind of expanding that. And this first book I've done is all about steak. If you're a steak lover, what are you looking for? Where do you get it? How do you deal with butchers? How do you store it? Seasoning, preparation, cooking, resting, carving. What do you eat with it? This whole kind of thing, and a little bit of the stuff around, the sort of regenerative agriculture side of things, but that's not, my area of expertise. And I'll let Rob Wolf and Diana Rogers tell everyone in great detail how that works, because they're so
I had a great interview with Diana Rogers, and I just got to ask all the questions I have about meat, and it was super, super helpful. I love the book. I love her. And so, and anybody watching, I will link a card. Oh my God, I never get to put cards up, but I'm going to link a card so you can
link a card.
Yeah.
It is amazing, that kind of information. And to see, that sort of dispassionate dismantling of the mainstream kind of narrative. I mean, I think we have to be, we have to be open more than ever, I think, at the moment to just assessing sensibly what's going on. I mean, we see this with COVID, of course. It's very firmly, you know, there's all kinds of different sort of conflicting narratives going on, and we have to sort of be a little bit sensible about how we dissect that. But it's actually true of everything in life. I mean, I look at my daughter and I think this generation, their ability to tease out what is bullshit and what isn't is going to be tested more than any other generation before. And, you know, we have to look at these things, but from every angle, because I think in the carnivore community, you know, there's a lot of nonsense as well. We're far too prone to sort of demonizing certain things, which really we shouldn't. You know, people get very, very dogmatic, as you know, and actually there are lots of ways to make this work for all kinds of different people. And you know, even people eating plant-based, I mean, you know, it's not our wheelhouse, it's not what we think is a good idea, but it's better than processed food, isn't it? You know, and so we have to kind of keep our minds open to everything. And I hope I've definitely changed my opinions a lot over the last few years. I'm sure you have, and I hope I'll continue to be open to that.
Yeah. I mean, I like to work with people and to help people get on the carnivore diet. And of course, through that experience, like, you know, everybody's different. People have different like stuff going on. And so, and just like you just kind of have to find the path forward to where you're happiest and most comfortable. And yeah, and you can't just kind of go with what, you know, the rules are. And I found, you know, just have a steak, you know, that advice is actually not helpful for almost everyone because it, you know, it doesn't lend you to eating enough fat, to paying attention to electrolytes, to paying attention to your body. So, you know, while it's simple, you know, just eat from the animal kingdom, it's not, you know, it shouldn't be dogmatic, and, you know, it does have to have some nuance to it. So I totally get that.
No, it's highly nuanced. I mean, I think, you know, there's another thing that's really important to kind of acknowledge of this is so we are such a self-destructive species. I mean, you know, if we look
yes.
if we look, so like, okay, so the Hadza thing. I mean, because this is just,
wait,
you know,
I actually wanted to ask before. You said somebody had just come back from to, you know, spending time with the Hadza. I don't know who that is, and
so
just give a little more background there.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
Paul Saladino and Brian Sanders and Eric Admides and those guys, they just had a trip there. And so everybody's kind of talking about this now. But when they came back, they pointed out straight away, oh, you know, these guys, yes, yeah, they're eating animals. They hardly eat any fiber. There's a little bit of tubers that they spit out, and then there's some berries and honey, but basically it's this kind of thing. And okay, yeah, great. But they also smoke like chimneys constantly, tobacco. This, so these people, you know, they're smoking like chimneys. They said, we have no doubt whatsoever, if there was alcohol, they'd be drinking. You know, when the missionaries bring the sugali, which is like kind of cornmeal stuff, they're just eating that. You know, we're human beings. There's no kind of enlightenment. There's no wonderful, you know, there's no wonderful magic thing where you eat it. Basically, what we'll do is we will eat. Almost all of us will eat until there's no food left, because that is our biological sort of imperative for survival. Just if it's there, eat it now, because it might not be there tomorrow. And we'll eat whatever. If it makes us feel good, if there's a nice dopamine hit on the end of it, we're in there. You know, and this of course is an evolutionary advantage that kept us alive 30,000 years ago, and it's killing us today. And it just the same as having blood that clots too readily, or you know, retention of iron, things that would have saved your life back then, which now are a bit of a disaster, quite frankly. So whichever way we cut it, whichever way we're eating, whatever way we do it, we have to acknowledge the fact that we can't just always eat as much as we want. We're likely to go wrong, most of us. some people, one of the great things about carnivore diet is that it does seem to have this satiety factor. It does help people to slightly pull back. And obviously, you know, in my own case, I was able to get very underweight on it, but I wasn't eating ad libitum. But, you know, I think we do have to slightly acknowledge our weakness as a species in all this. There's always going to have to be some thought and nuance around what we do. If we just do what we want to do, well, we'll just be taking crack and drinking and eating Twinkies, you know, by Thursday. So, you know, that's the human condition.
Yeah, indeed, I agree. That's been my experience. And if smoking didn't kill me, I'd still be smoking 2 packs a day right now.
Yeah, well, I think I would too. I mean, I kind of got to a point with smoking when I mean, luckily I quit smoking many, many years ago in my early 20s, but I only achieved that by making myself so disgusted by it. I smoked so much that I just couldn't smoke anymore. And I was lucky that when I then drank, I didn't want to smoke, which was kind of like that's a bit of a decider, I think, for a lot of people. But anyway, I mean, obviously we're not here to talk about smoking, but we could talk a bit more about steak if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you know, steak is obviously the kind of poster. It's the poster meal for the carnivore community, and there's a few things. Shall I give you my top? Oh, look, you mentioned steak.
Sorry. I know.
And the dogs are in there. Dogs follow me along the street when I've been doing meat breakdowns.
Yes. Yeah.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about cooking steaks. The difference between a steak at home and a steak in a restaurant. So the first thing that you notice is that a professional chef will season food far, far more than we do. The amount of salt they're adding is really quite significant. So why are they doing this? Well, the moment that salt hits your palate, it opens up your taste buds and you get this great rush of sort of saliva for one, you know, your mouth literally starts to water as a result of that salt. And that's carrying the flavor of the meat in. So, you know, really, if you just have a steak and you season it just with salt, which is actually my preference, if you get the most salt you can before you start to feel actually nauseous, you're maximizing the amount of sort of flavor exposure to that meat. People talk about seasoning the day before. You know, some chefs will season stuff the night before and leave it.
So when you say season, are you talking just specifically about salt, or is there other seasonings? Okay,
no,
so not other herbs and spices.
No, exactly. Salt specifically, you know, as a sort of technical term, seasoning is going to be salt. Now, some people obviously are going to be adding pepper, other spices. Personally, that's not my preference, because I like on the steak itself to keep quite the sort of purity of the flavor. Now, I might want to serve with it a salsa verde or a pesto or some kind of other additional condiment that is going to increase that flavor, but I don't want to lose the ability to just taste the steak on its own if I want to do that. And salt is kind of a part of maximizing that, of bringing that out. I'm not saying for a moment that people shouldn't use their rubs or whatever if they want to. I mean, obviously on carnivore, it's a little bit difficult because these things do tend to just contain stuff that we should probably be avoiding. And, you know, particularly a lot of those dried spices have got those kind of, you know, nightshade plants, dried, ground in them. But yeah,
Well,
so
I have a problem with eczema, and so I just decided to really focus on taking out all the salicylates. So I took out all the herbs and spices and the things that I use, and it actually did make a difference. And now my taste buds have completely changed, and it's like
yeah.
anything more than salt, and I'm like, ugh, this is like too much.
Yeah, it's a little full on. I mean, I quite like sometimes, like if I'm cooking lamb chops or something, I quite like to
Hmm.
do that thing where you just cut a garlic clove in half and just rub it on a little bit. You know, that's kind of quite nice on lamb, but on beef, I'm anything like you say, anything more than salt. You know, and that's not just a kind of carnivore thing. I mean, if you go to the best steak restaurants in the world, they're doing the same thing. You know, you don't find a lot of pepper going on there. They might grind a bit of black pepper on afterwards, but not usually. You know, it's kind of the salt and the meat. And if you get the meat right, if it's really good, amazing beef, particularly if it's aged, if it's dry aged, but dry aged really well, because actually, you know, dry aging can be awful and it can be amazing, and it very much depends on the amount of airflow and the temperature and the humidity of that environment. You know, a lot of butchers will just say, oh, they'll just hang the meat up the back for a month and say it's been dry aged because it's not been shrink wrapped in a wet age bag. Um, and actually, it can make it just sort of rancid and acidic and not nice if the wrong strains of mold are growing on it. So, you know, it's really about the exact conditions that they create there. But when you get a good bit of dry aged beef, I mean, oh god, some of that stuff I've given people like little raw wafer thin slices of really well dry aged rib, and they said, what is this? It's like the finest salami I've ever had. You know, it's stunning. So you know, obviously we need to look at where we get our meat from, and there is a cost factor there. You know, anybody that says, oh well, you know, it's anyone can do it, yeah, you do actually save a lot of money by not buying plants. So particularly if you're buying organic, which most of us would be with our kind of mindset, you know, it's very expensive. But still, to buy dry aged beef rib is not cheap in anyone's book. So we do have to acknowledge that. And I'm not saying for a moment that people should go out and buy dry aged beef every day. But if you get a chance to do it for special occasions, then that is kind of where the texture and flavor upgrade really lives. Because you know, what happens is that these strains of mold, these Staphylococcus mold, it actually works its way into the fibers of the beef, and it just slightly breaks down the proteins. So those directional fibers lose their kind of structural integrity a little bit. We're getting a flavor upgrade from this slight kind of, it's almost like a fine Swiss cheese type of thing that can happen with the fat. You know, but if you're seeing kind of big sort of lumps of kind of furry mold on a piece of meat, you know, all that stuff needs to be trimmed away, and it shouldn't be there. If that's worked its way inside between the seams of the meat and the fat, you know, if it tastes sort of moldy and acrid, it's not a good thing. It's not supposed to be that way. So, you know, watch out for that kind of stuff. Let your nose be the guide. If something's appetizing, then it's appetizing, and if it's not, then I'd avoid. You know, I'd
Hmm.
avoid. You're not gonna find me eating fermented liver.
Okay, well that's
so, so,
yeah,
so,
that's
so
good
that,
advice.
you know, that would be a couple of things. But then, when we come to talking about steak cookery, what we're really, the real crux of the matter is this. Okay, we want to develop a really flavorsome crust while the inside is the correct level of doneness. And there's various mistakes we can make. If we cook too hot, then what's going to happen is we're just going to burn the outside of the meat. So if we go onto very hot coals, we're just going to burn the outside of the meat before we've had a chance to cook the middle. If we go too cold, let's say we put our steak into a lukewarm skillet, what's going to happen is that immediately the water that's in the steak, and even with the steak that is dry aged and feels quite sort of dry, there's a lot of water in there. Most of the weight is water, unless it's got a bone. But what's going to happen, that water immediately going to move outwards. As soon as the heat's applied, it's going to start moving outwards to the surface of the steak. And the moment it emerges on that surface, what we want to happen is for the water to immediately evaporate away, and for the sort of solid substances within that liquid to adhere to the crust and to help to form the crust and the flavor of the steak. But if it's not hot enough, what's going to happen is it's just going to be sitting in a puddle. The water's going to pool out and the steak's going to boil. So, we have these kinds of issues. We need to get the temperature right. And we also need to work out what our medium is. If we're cooking in a skillet, then we're really cooking in fat. It's not the metal of the skillet, it's not the iron or the steel that's cooking the meat. If we try to sear a steak with metal, what will happen is you'll get those black burnt patches on the surface of the steak where it actually makes contact. It'll be pale in the gaps where it didn't make contact, and the whole thing will just have this kind of slightly dry surface. That in that scenario, what we want is the fat to actually, a deep pool of tallow in the skillet, or you can use duck fat or whatever you have, lard. But it's that contact between the fat and the meat that's doing the searing. So the classic approach there is to sear it first, and then to put it into a low oven to finish if it needs it. If it's thin enough, and if it's not too cold when we start, then it's going to cook through at a similar sort of time as the crust forms. And so we start to develop an instinct, and look at this steak. How hot or cold is it? How thick is it? Am I going to need to finish this off in the oven, after I form my crust or not? Now, if you're not sure, I would be very careful with the reverse sear. So the reverse sear is kind of very popular at the moment, particularly sort of on Instagram. You're cooking the steak gently through and then searing it at the end. Now that could be really useful in certain scenarios, particularly, if you're using sous vide to cook the steak through, then you can hold it at temperature for a long time while you prepare other parts of the meal or guests, what have you. If you're cooking it through in the oven slowly, then it's gonna dry the surface of the meat out, which is quite good for forming the crust. So there are advantages, but the disadvantage then is that when you come to sear, you are limited in how long you can let that crust form, because you're going to overcook the steak. So I would say, unless it's a very thick piece of meat, you're better off getting your crust exactly the way you want it. Then check the temperature with a probe. If you need to finish in the oven, finish in the oven. If you don't, then you're all good to go and you can move on to resting. And this is my next tip. The cooking part with the heat is only half the cooking. The steak's going to finish cooking as it rests. So the moment you take it out of the pan, inside, all that water still moving outwards towards the edge of the steak. It's still going to be moving. So what we do is we put it on a roasting rack, which allows any of that moisture to drip away onto a plate and not to pool around the crust and make the crust soggy. So we rest the steak on a rack and it's going to come up, and how much it comes up is going to depend on how hot it was cooked and how thick it is. A thick steak is going to hold temperature for a longer time. So if we have a thick bone-in rib, we can expect that to come up maybe 15 degrees. So if we take that off when it's 40 degrees, 40 degrees internally is basically blue, we take it off at 40 degrees and we leave it for a good 10, 15 minutes on the rack, it's going to come up to about 55 medium rare. So I'm talking centigrade. Those temperatures would be 40 would be 105. 40 would be 105. So it's going to come up quite a lot more to medium rare. So if we disregard the resting, if we cut the steak too quickly, what's going to happen is all of that moisture that's moving around is just going to gush out everywhere. It's going to drip out a bit anyway, but what we really want is for it to slowly stop fizzling and then just settle inside the meat. And then when we cut it, it's going to be nice and juicy. We'll still get a little bit of moisture leaking, but it's going to be staying, it's not going to be rushing around, you know, because if we cut those fibers when they're still fizzling away, the water rushes out and the fibers tighten up. So we've got a texture upgrade and a kind of succulence upgrade by resting that meat properly. And that takes me, I guess, to the final tip, which would be, when you cut a steak, cut it with a sharp knife across the grain. So this is not so much an issue where you don't have a clear grain. Like with tenderloin, it's very soft fibers. You don't tend to have this issue. But with, say, what you guys call top sirloin, we call it rump, or a flank steak is a perfect example. It has very thick directional fibers, and we need to, if we cut along those fibers, so our little piece of steak has them running in long sections, we're going to find that very chewy. So if we cut it across the direction of the fibers, then we're shortening them right up, and it's making for a much more tender mouthful. And that is actually a reason why you, as the cook, you might want to carve steak on the board and give it to people, rather than give them a whole steak on the plate and a knife and fork, because if they don't understand these factors, they're going to have a less good experience. You know, it's not patronizing to carve it with a sharp knife. You know, we can't give everyone a board and a knife at the table. So those would just be some kind of tips. I would use a probe, get a thermopen and use it, because all that stuff you read a lot, you know, about the squeezing the thumb, you know, yeah, if I squeeze my thumb here and I do this, okay, nonsense. All right, it's
yeah, I just bought a meat thermometer and it's like, yeah, this is way better.
That
I don't understand the other stuff.
Exactly. Go straight to the end point. You know, I mean, yes, I'm not saying don't give it a push and a pull. If you know how tender it was to handle when it was raw, then you can judge a little bit how much firmer it's got. But you know, if it, particularly if it's a thicker steak where you can't feel easily what's happening in the center from the outside, use a probe. It's a no-brainer, and you'll very soon, from using the probe, you'll very soon get a sense of how your steaks on your skillet or on your grill in your kitchen, how that behaves, and then you don't need to use it so much. But yeah, I think that is the way, if you're trying to learn the art of really good steak cookery, you know, check with a probe.
I have a couple questions.
Go on.
So putting the fat in the skillet is super helpful. So I had just read, you know, you crank up the skillet, you put the fire up as high as it can go, you get the pan screaming hot, and you put the steak in 3 minutes on one side and 2 minutes on the other, and you're done. And that never seemed to work for me. So, did I need to put fat in the skillet first and have it really hot? But sometimes I can see it starting to smoke, so then I feel like, okay, that's too hot. How do I navigate that there?
Okay. So yes, if you're cooking in a skillet, cook in a deep pool of tallow. You know, that is by far and away the way to get the best crust on the steak. Now, if it's a thick steak, I would anticipate that you are going to need to, and by thick, what do I mean? Well, if it's a couple of inches thick, let's say, you know, or if it's like a bone-in ribeye type thickness, like a sharing steak, you know, or Sean Baker's little bedtime snack, then you know, you need to you might need to have a low oven on to finish off. Okay, but in terms of the heat of that tallow, like you say, you how hot it is depends. It's going to affect how long you can leave that steak in there. You know, within a couple of minutes, it's gonna form a pretty good crust. And at that point, you're going to start to think about taking it out of the tallow. Now, you never want the tallow to be sort of medium hot, because what's going to happen is, or not medium hot, but like lukewarm, like not. So when you put the steak in, you want to see an immediate rush of that steam, immediate and a noise. Now, what's happening is, as we said before, what's happening is that water evaporating, and it evaporates instantly. And the second it vanishes away, it leaves those deposits on the crust of the steak. Now, if that doesn't happen, if you put your steak into tallow and there is not an immediate sizzle, an immediate reaction, take it out straight away, because what you've got on your hands there is not cooking, it's a drowning, and you need to rescue it, because it's going to start to boil. It's going to boil. So what we're going to do then is you're focusing on that crust first. Now, if it's normal steak like you or I are going to have for dinner, it's gonna, by the time that crust is done, it's gonna basically be cooked. I wouldn't get too caught up with the exact timings, because that can change depending on how big the steak is, how cold it was, whether you had time to take it out of the fridge a little bit before, all this kind of stuff, how much water it's got in it, whether it was wet aged or dry aged. I use the probe and I just focus on forming the crust as quickly as possible, and then that way you're safe. You've got your crust. If you need to leave the steak in the oven to get it to come up to that 105 internal, then rest it, and when you cut it, it's going to be perfect.
So then so part of the process is salting it before I start cooking it, right? And does it need to rest at room temperature? How quickly or how much before you start cooking do you need to salt it?
Well, okay.
And how much salt?
Okay, so how much salt? This is something that everybody's going to have to experiment with. You're going to have to find the point at which it's enough. And not too much. And there's a lot of factors around that. I talk about this quite a bit in the book, but there are a lot of factors, and it's things like the exact type of salt. Some salts are much saltier than others. Whether it's a rolled salt, so flakes, which would be kosher salt or molten salt, whether it's big or small, whether if it's crystals, if it's fine crystals or big crystals. I mean, and then the cooking method. So let's say, for example, and the size of the steak. So let's say I've got a thin steak, and I'm going to cook it in a skillet on the hob. And I'm using quite a mild salt, and it's fine. It's a fine amount, okay? If it's a fine grind. So if it's a fine salt, it's going to adhere more readily to the surface than big chunks. So you can imagine, if I've got big thick crystals, some of them are going to fall off. He's talking about steak, it always gets the dogs.
Evidently.
So if we've got these big thick crystals, some of them are going to fall off. Now, if we're cooking out on a grill and they fall off, they're gone, right? They're going to fall through the grate. If we're cooking in a skillet, they're going to remain in the skillet, and the chances are, particularly if we then pour those fats back over the steak, we're going to start reincorporating some of that salt. It might stick back on at some point during the cooking process, so we haven't lost it necessarily. So we're going to have to start to think what I would do initially. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if we're talking about a thicker steak, then as the thickness increases, we have less crust versus internal. So we might add a little bit more salt than we would to a very thin steak. If we're cooking outdoors, we might anticipate losing a bit more. So we start to build up this picture through experience of, this is the salt I use, this is how much of it I seem to need to make this work, and And if I'm an amateur cook, the chances are I can put on a lot more than I am doing at the moment. So, experiment with it. You can always add a little bit more, but it's never quite the same as when it's sort of part of the crust formation. Now,
so another question, real quick. Like I've done a lot of different things. So when I have salted the steak 2 hours before I plan to cook it and left it in the refrigerator on a rack, it gets nice and dry on the exterior and the salt is good and it tends to, work out well. Then other times I'll take it out and put it on the counter a half an hour before I'm going to cook it. I salt it and like all this water is just come to the surface. So there's like puddles of water and it's wetter and it doesn't work as well.
Yeah. So exactly. Okay. So say we season the steak the night before. What's going to happen is that salt is basically going to sort of melt and water is going to come out of the surface of the steak. The salt will draw water out and it'll actually then, some of it will evaporate and some of it will even be drawn back in and taking some salt with it. So we're probably going to get a deeper kind of level of seasoning going into the meat, and obviously with that salt dissolved, it's no longer in a kind of form where it's going to fall off. So that's going to affect the way we do things. If we do it too long in advance, what's going to happen is it's going to start to cure the meat, and we're going to get a slightly rubbery layer on the outside. If we then take the steak out of the fridge, say half an hour before, like you said, and we season it immediately, what's going to happen is that the water's going to come out and it's not going to have a time to evaporate or to be drawn back in. So that's almost like the worst time to do it.
Okay, so, a half an hour bad.
Yeah, half an hour is not
2
good.
hours better.
Yeah, so then it's a question. I mean, also if you leave it out of the fridge for a longer period of time, what's going to happen is that you're going to get a more even cook because the temperature of the meat will be less cold. I won't say it'll come up to room temperature because actually it takes ages for that to happen. If you put a probe in a raw steak that's been on the counter for 2 hours, it's still in the middle. It's probably still not going to be 20 degrees, But as that steak sits out, we're going to get a higher overall temperature, and then when we cook it, it's going to be more even top to bottom. You won't get that bit where you're desperately trying to apply all this heat to the outside to get that bit in the middle to finally cook. But with a thin steak, you might want it to be fridge cold because you might say to yourself, well, actually, this steak overcooks all the time. By the time I form my crust, it's always overcooked. So you're going to make it fridge cold. Some people talk about freezing steaks for that reason, but personally, I find if you freeze something, a lot of water comes out of it when you put it in. So you're going to lose a hell of a lot of temperature from that fat. So you better make sure it's not going to boil, But then to your question with the fat, yes, you want a deep pool of tallow, but also if it's a steak with a very thick fat cap along one edge, what you can do is get a pair of locking tongs, put the steak into a dry skillet and turn the heat on it. It doesn't need to be searing hot before you put it in. You can just put some heat on. It's like you do with duck breast, and put locking tongs on to just hold it upright. And as that pan heats up, it's going to start gradually rendering more. Oh my God,
that never occurred to me that I could just use my tongs, lock it, and leave it there instead of standing there and holding it myself.
Go out with the dog. Go out with the dog. And I'll tell you another tip is that sometimes when you don't have quite enough fat in the skillet, or it's all spat everywhere and it's looking a bit thing, and you end up tilting it slightly to create a little pool of fat down one end, stick a jam jar underneath the handle of the skillet and then it'll sit on it and you can hands off.
Wow.
I know.
Just full of great little tips.
Groundbreaking.
Yes.
Who knew the jam jar tip? Yeah, for sure. I mean, these things come down to experience, but I think it's a question with people of getting the confidence together to just know what they're going for. You can do it. You can nail it.
Well, one more question that I have a problem with, and I think other people do too, is when I cook and it's starting to look like it's creating a nice, crust, but then when I flip it over, it starts curling up, and so the center part that's in contact with the pan is getting a nice crust, but the edges now are just curled up, and I'm like, do I take a spatula and try to smush it down, or what's happening there? I feel like there's some evaporation temperature thing going on.
So yeah, okay. So with certain cuts of steak, and particularly if they're on the thinner side, what's going to happen is that the seams of connective tissue that run around the edge of the steak, particularly like in a ribeye, there's one that goes around the eye fillet itself. What can happen is that those can tighten up, and the thing goes like a fish, and it starts to curl up. Yeah. So if that's happening to you while it's in the pan, what you could do is just take a little pair of kitchen scissors or a sharp knife and see where the connective tissue is pulling up, and just snip it through as it starts to happen. And then obviously, if you need to apply a little bit of pressure, I mean, be careful not to kind of crush the life out of it, but you might have to just get in there with the tongs and manhandle bits into the fat. The deeper the fat, of course, the less this problem exists. Because I mean, in an ideal world, we probably just deep fry the steak in a great pool of tallow. But of course, who's got a great pool of tallow? If you want a
I've done that. I mean, I feel like my best results have been when I've done that, where I've had like this much tallow in a cast iron skillet. And then I thought, I'm doing this wrong, and this is crazy, but it tastes so good, and it's working.
No, it's not wrong. No, it's not wrong. I mean, it's only wrong if you put a steak in there that's massive, and then it's not cooked. It's kind of completely raw, too raw for you in the middle. I mean, I ate raw for a year, so I don't go. But mind you, having said that, I don't like. I tell you what, I don't like. I don't like a seared crust and then a really blue steak. I actually don't like that. If it's, I either like it completely raw or kind of rare, like, which is cooked quite a lot more than that sort of blue thing. But yeah, there's no, if you can get a good crust with a real depth, a real sort of salty intensity to it, and the doneness is right, you're bang on. That's great. I will say, if you can, I mean, I appreciate, depending on where people live, what outdoor spaces are available to them, it can sometimes be impossible. But if you can cook over coals, that is a flavor upgrade for a steak, which is hard to beat. And it definitely speaks to this kind of primal side of us. If there's any doubt that we ate a lot of meat and that we cooked it with fire, it's gone. When you have a steak cooked over coals, it just speaks to this kind of very animal part of us. And
so a lot of the audience does grill, so definitely dive right in and let us know best ways of grilling.
Well, I mean, I would say, the main factors with that kind of cooking is the quality of the fuel. If you're using wood, if you've got time to burn down wood, and you use, I know there's a lot of you folks over in the States, you've got access to amazing oak and stuff for cooking, and the inclination to spend time getting that right. If you can do that, then that's really the ultimate thing. A really good quality flavoursome wood burned down well, or lump wood charcoal made from the same thing is the quick way to do that. But definitely not pre-formed briquettes, definitely not those instant lighting coals with the accelerant on. You know, these cooking with coals like that, you know, it has a flavor that gas doesn't give you. And gas also can sometimes have a bit of a flavor of its own, which is not such a good thing. I don't prefer gas, but it's oh,
Sorry
no worries.
about
Yeah, no,
that.
mine did that too. I don't prefer gas, but it's 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 so much more convenient, and sometimes, you know, people are just not in a position to cook with coals. But you know, that's what, if you're looking for the kind of ultimate thing, I would encourage people to explore cooking with coals. But you know, whatever your cooking method, what you've got to, one really important tip with cooking is make your life easy. If you have a small grill, a small charcoal grill, you know, and it's the middle of winter and you have a lot of guests, don't use the charcoal grill. However great that steak is going to be, it's going to make your life so difficult. You're going to be outside in the snow trying to grill multiple steaks which don't fit on your small grill, and you know, and you've got guests and all this, you know, you're basically making your life difficult. So if I need to cook steaks for a lot of people, I'm probably going to use a gas grill. I've got a gas grill, a Weber, which is much bigger because it's got lots of space. Or I might, if I've got really complicated stuff to do, I might sous vide the steaks and leave them in the water bath, hold them at temperature while I get everything else ready and everything on the table or whatever, and then quickly sear them in tallow, because I know that that's going to be a really rapid process. I don't need to rest the steak for so long when it's been sous vide, because there's not so much excitement within the meat. There'll be a little bit after it's been in the sear, but not as much as if I'd cooked it hotter from start to finish. So it's little factors like this, and there's all this stuff in the book of how to break this down. But there's a lot of ways we can make our lives easier. But you know, you wanna aim just not to have a disaster, and then things usually go right.
Yeah.
I think Chris Hadfield is the astronaut guy. Commander Chris Hadfield. He wrote this book about being an astronaut, and in it he said, aim to be a zero. So that, like, their whole philosophy is that you don't try and save the day if you're an astronaut, because then you make a mistake. What you do is just try not to make things go wrong. And cooking can be the way too. You know, you kind of identify what the problems are, but you know, within the boundaries of prioritizing things. If I'm cooking for you, and I make you a steak and some vegetables or something. I mean, I probably wouldn't because you're carnivore, but say I'm cooking and I'm making steak and vegetables. If I get the steak right and the vegetables are kind of rubbish, I've won. If the vegetables are perfect and the steak is terrible, I've totally screwed up. So, you know, work out where the priority is, get the important thing right, but make your life easy in the process.
Wow. It's amazing advice. So, what kind of feedback do you get from people who have gotten your book? Like, have they upped their steak game? You know, is this going to turn me into a fantastic griller, cooker, whatever?
Well, yeah, all three of them have been thrilled. No, so I had a guy the other day, a guy called Tom, sent me a picture of this incredible looking steak. He's done steak and chips, we call them fries for you guys. Steak and chips with a creamed spinach that he'd made for him and his partner. It looked absolutely brilliant. And I've had quite a few people get in touch and say, oh, you know, this is just, it's totally changed my steak game. So, I mean, I couldn't be more thrilled to hear that. And if anybody does buy the book, if anybody gets anything out of it, please send me pictures. Come find me on Instagram. Send me your steak pictures. There's nothing that I like more than seeing people make progress with their food, and it's hugely rewarding. And as I always say, you know, if you read the steak book, then you'll know everything that I know about steak, plus everything you know about steak. So really, you'll just then know more than me. So you can send me a picture, and then I can get your advice.
I'm totally gonna do that. And I do try to post my pictures of steak, but I'm not always pleased with how they've turned out. And one of the things I've done that I guess I'm slightly embarrassed about is just cutting up the steak into small cubes and putting it in the air fryer. And I call it, I mean, it's like toddler food, because it's little bite-sized pieces of steak that like a 2-year-old could eat on their own. And but I find that way I'm able to get more of a crust. There's more surface area that gets
Yes.
gets crisped up. And I love a ribeye, but I hate that that piece of fat that's in the middle. Like it only gets seared on, the top and the bottom, but inside there can still be kind of a lot of fat there that's not crisped up. So that has been, sort of my way of dealing with that. Or do the steak, take the pictures, and then, carve up the steak and mangle it up, and then take the fat, put it back in the pan to get crispy, and then bring it back out.
There's nothing wrong with doing that. And if you, I mean, with the air fryer, I haven't used an air fryer. Actually, it's all the kind of rage at the moment, but I don't actually have one. It's not really my kind of thing. But at the same time, I think if that works for you, then that's absolutely great. And I've seen pictures of air fried steaks that look like they've got a great crust and the doneness is perfect. That is the metric. If you season it well and you've got the right crust and the doneness is what you want, then you're basically winning. I mean, another tip I'll give you, if you've got a steak with a bone in, you can you take it off, rest it, cut the bone off, leave a little bit of, don't be crazy trimming it off, just leave a little bit of meat on it. Put the bone back in the air fryer or back on the grill or back in the skillet and carve the rest of the steak. And a couple of minutes later, that bone will be all crisp. And instead of having that kind of rather uninspiring kind of raw collagen-y bit that was stuck to the bone that you have to kind of eat like a rabid dog, you sitting there chewing on it like the Flintstones. You get this amazing like little crisp bit that goes all the way down. So that's a real nice treat as well, a little extra thing that you can do. But yeah, with those bits of fat, it's not everyone's bag. I mean, I love those bits of sort of slightly raw fat. I'll eat those all day. But if you don't, then it does make sense to try and find ways around that. If you take that little block out, as you say, when you've cooked it, pop it back in the pan, and then you get a nice little, crisp crackling at the end of it.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't look pretty, but it's good. The air fryer I love and I use it all the time, but it doesn't look pretty. Like I wouldn't make a steak in there and take a picture. Like I don't I've never been able to achieve a crust, but cutting it up into the little cubes allows you to get that browning and the crisping of the fat with that I don't know, I just haven't been able to get that like trying to cook a whole steak. But I do have one question. So for a while I was cooking, I guess you would call them pork steaks, I mean, they're, yeah. So, and I find that pork seems to, especially when you deep fry it, it seems to like emit like a liquid out in a much different way than beef does. And then that fries up and crisps up and turns into the most delicious crispy things I've ever eaten. So why does pork do that, but beef doesn't?
Well, I mean, pork is quite a different nutritional profile. If you get cured pork like prosciutto, for example, with with the fat on it, where it's thinly sliced, and you leave that out at room temperature, it'll literally the fat will start to melt. It'll start, when it goes all glistening and transparent, it starts to melt. And this is because, pork fat is primarily oleic acid. And as we, so it's a monounsaturated fat, much more so than beef. And as we've started to feed pigs more and more polyunsaturated fat, they're getting more and more vegetable oil as part of their feed. Because they're monogastric animals like humans, chickens, pigs, monogastric, they can't convert that fat to saturated fat. So what happens is it goes down into their fat as unsaturated. So what you tend to get with pork is a slightly different cook because the fat is less stable, it's less solid at room temperature, it tends to render out more. So you're going to end up with a situation where you, like the lamb, for example, which probably has the most sort of saturated fat content, the most stearic acid in its fat, that's where you tend to get those kind of lumps of unrendered fat that you didn't want, on a rack or something. It's thick and it's not really melting down. With pork, it melts very, very readily. It's very quickly going to start melting out. So that's why you're getting that sort of deliciousness with pork.
So it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I have all kinds of allergies and stuff, and I think, like you, I also probably have a problem with histamines. So I only allow myself a little bit of like sausage and especially like salamis and charcuterie. Like, I can only have a little of that. I don't have pork rinds anymore. And I went through like a heavy pork phase and then was like, even a lot of fresh pork is a problem. So I only have it a little bit from time to time. I don't know if it's histamines.
I've got a problem with it too.
Okay.
I don't feel so great. Now, someone was telling me the other day that if you brine it, if you wet brine it for a number of hours, it seems to change that. And certainly anecdotally, I've heard a lot of people say that they get less problems from, say, bacon, from cured pork, than they do from fresh pork. So that could be a factor worth exploring. But I mean, and that's interesting, from a histamine point of view, you'd think that the cured pork would have the worst histamine content.
I definitely have a terrible reaction to bacon. So I stopped eating that probably a year ago. I just, finally was like, I mean, I can have like one piece of bacon, but, who's going to do that? Of course you're going to eat like the whole pack.
No, I mean, the bacon's like biscuits, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
You're going to eat the whole pack. Pack. In fact, why don't they make the pack bigger? It's
right?
It's a constant question. I mean, there's this amazing thing that I was making for a while, which is pork. So you get pork belly and you cut it into cubes, like 2-inch cubes, and you put it in boiling salted water, and you just let it boil. As it boils, you skim off any impurities and you let it boil down and down and down and down and down and down and down until the water all evaporates away, and there'll be rendered fat then at that point in the pan, and you just let them crisp up. So you boil it for like 2 or 3 hours, and at that point they're super tender, like falling apart tender, but also then they go all crisp, and it's just insane, pork belly bites. But
everybody who's listening, that sounds amazing, and I am not going to do pork belly anymore, but the rest of you, oh my god, you must do that and tell me how it turns out.
It's so good, but I didn't feel well on it. I didn't feel well on it either, so I don't do that anymore. But what I would recommend to people, if you're looking for something that is that, in fact, more delicious than that, beef tongue, ox tongue.
Wow.
Okay, so an ox tongue is the singular most revolting item you've ever set your eyes on. I mean, it literally is like a disgusting...
I have one in the freezer now, so what you say, I'm going to do this week.
Okay, this is it. So it's, I mean, you know what those things are like. It's just like a disgusting comedy tongue. And anyway, so get your ox tongue, rinse it off, pop it into boiling water, and just simmer it away. Skim any impurities, just skim them off the top of the spoon, and let it simmer for a good 3 hours. Take it out, and the skin, which is like the most revolting thing in the history of the world, it will just kind of peel off. Be a little careful, because underneath the skin there's fats, hot fats, and you can scald yourself. But just peel the skin off. If there's any bits that are a bit sticky, just slice them off with a knife. So then you've got this kind of peeled, boiled tongue. I know I'm not selling it yet. Cut it into slices, like kind of a centimeter thick, and put it into a dry non-stick frying pan, and turn the heat on it, and it will it's a really, really easily melting fat in the tongue, and it will just render out, and you just season it and put the slices in there, and it will render out, and it is insanely nice. But I will warn you, that gave me a bit of a histamine reaction as well, but it's worth it. I'd happily explode with histamine eating ox tongue. It is the most delicious thing. It's ridiculous.
Wait, why do organs have more histamines?
Why? I don't know.
Okay.
I'm actually not sure. For me, so I think there's part of the reason is that it's possibly the type of amino acids. So the more kind of structural stuff that it has in it, that when that breaks down, it seems to create more histamine compounds than just. I mean, I find the thing that's easiest from that point of view is just things like a lightly cooked steak that's not a dry aged steak, but a wet aged steak, lightly cooked. It's not the best steak in the world. It's not the best way to do it, but that is much lower histamine for me than, say, something slow cooked with a bone in, or something where a lot of collagen has broken down through it. That seems to be worse for me. So I don't know what you find, but
I mean, I enjoyed oxtails, and I haven't noticed a response there. I feel like when I'm eating beef, it's fine. But
Good.
That being said, I don't know that I've ever had fresh beef. So it could be that I feel, very different if I were really eating freshly killed meat. So, but I, have not even remotely made an effort to figure out even how I would do that. I mean, it's hard in New York City because there's so much, people really want lean meat, chicken, fish. So it's hard for me to find, very fatty, untrimmed cuts of beef. I see other people on Instagram. I'm like, where are you living? Because I gotta go there.
Yeah, no, I know. And of course, it's you can't just go killing cows either, willy-nilly. It's frowned upon. You could take one for the team. You could try it for us. Let us know what it's like getting that very fresh, eating it, practically as it falls.
Yeah.
Well, so that's where things like ox cheeks and tongue can be really good, because they have the fat within them. And obviously, then it just comes back to buying expensive rib and stuff like that, which is, it's a difficult one. I know what you mean. People, I actually find it's worse in restaurants. Restaurants are the worst thing. So if I go to a restaurant and I ask for a steak, I'll always say to the waiter, listen, can you tell them to pick the fattiest one? They haven't got one. I've
totally done that. And they're like, oh, you want no fat? And I'm like, no fattest. And they're like, no fat. Yes, I understand your diet. And I'm like, I'm a woman, but I'm asking you for fat. And there's a sexism there too, where people are like, you want steak and fat?
Yeah, it's not, I totally, it's exactly the same thing. And people look at you and they're just like, okay, no fat, no. And of course, I mean, we all know this as carnivores as well. They just assume that you're making a mistake when you ask them for the steak without the vegetables anyway. So already they're thinking, this person is an idiot. They don't even know. They don't even understand the difference between asking for vegetables and asking for no vegetables. And then the thing, I mean, the number of times I've said, listen, can you just get the steak and put it on the plate with nothing else, literally nothing else? And they go, okay. And they're writing like this. And then they say, so what sides do you want with that? No. And then you kind of, and then, maybe someone else will get, like my wife will get involved as well. And then, we'll draw a diagram. And then anyway, they go away. And when the thing comes back, it'll come over and they go, right, here's your steak, no sides, no vegetables. Here you go. Like really proud. Here you are. And they put it down. There's a tomato sitting on top of it or something. Like, what's that doing there? Yeah. What's that? Take your nightshade fruit and remove it from my steak.
I know. Once I had a steak that it came with a shrimp on top, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm allergic to shrimp.
Oh,
I'm allergic to shrimp. I'm like, oh my god. Yeah.
What's doing there?
I guess they're like, you're not letting me put any garnish on. Please let me put something on to make it pretty.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't understand surf and turf. I mean, when do you? It's not like you find cows on the beach, even. Certainly not in the water.
I do love my scallops. I mean, I will pan fry some scallops in butter and have that with a steak. And lately I've also been taking to trying to deep fry my hamburgers, which is nice. It's very nice.
But scallops, if you can cook scallops well, then you can cook a steak well, because the principle's the same, isn't it? You've got to get that nice golden crisp outside thing going on, but then if you overcook them, it's the worst thing in the world. Like and if you boil them, if the pan's not hot enough and they boil, they're horrible. So you got it's actually even more. They're even less tolerant than a steak.
Well, I tend to cook them in the air fryer for like 3 minutes, just so that they're more or less cooked, and then just saute them in that way that once they hit the color I'm looking for, then we're done.
Yeah. They're awesome. I do like scallops. I didn't eat fish for the longest time, and I started back with some sockeye, and I did have a scallop the other day actually. Started back with that again recently, and actually really enjoying eating a little bit of fish. I've always just considered it a bit inferior to beef, and I'm afraid I still think that. But I do like a little bit.
It's different. But
the problem is, but ethically it's difficult because if I want to eat salmon, if I want to eat wild salmon, it has to come from the North Pacific. There's no source for it here. So, then I'm eating stuff which has been flown halfway across the world, which is kind of, I've kind of got a problem with that. So I'm having to juggle that one mentally a little bit,
Yeah.
But,
go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, one, we've had an amazing conversation, and I don't want to take all the secrets of your book. I really do encourage everybody to go ahead and pick it up. I have always wanted to figure out how to cook a steak properly, and had even considered taking a course before the whole world shut down. Because it's ridiculous that I was not able to, cook a piece of meat. I've taught myself some things, but even as my questions today showed, I still, hadn't quite gotten all the way there. But I do have one last question about the dry aging thing. So as a person who, I'm concerned about histamines, and then just as a regular person all my life, I've hated mushrooms. And I've always thought, why in the world would we consume mold? I mean, we legislate it out of our homes. Like, it's a major health problem for people. Like, why would I choose to eat this or put it in my food? So when I heard about the dry aging process and it being sort of controlled mold, I was just kind of like, that just doesn't appeal to me. And now being a carnivore, I've really given a lot more credence to my body. So if my body says, I don't like this, that means I don't like this. And for whatever reason, for me, it's not good. So I wonder if, moldy things just are not good for me, period.
Yeah, I mean, I would strongly suggest that you just trust your own judgment on that. I think if you go to a really, I mean, it might be worth one time just going to a really great steak place, and I mean, obviously you're in New York, so you can't even move without going to a great steak place. But go somewhere where you know that they're really hot on that stuff, and that they're dry. It's a particularly kind of a thing that they do, because it'll be good. And try it. And if you don't react to it and you love it, then it might be worth investigating some sources of dry aged beef. And if not, just if not, then fine. You do what you do, and it's not really, I don't think anyone should feel like they're inferior for wanting to eat wet aged beef or grain fed beef or whatever. We've all got to work around what's available to us and what we want to do. I think, again, this dogma, we have to be careful. The upgrade that we make by not having a load of processed food in our lives, that's huge, and it's massive. If someone wants to eat some plants, or if they want to eat wet aged or dry aged or grass fed or grain fed or whatever, the upgrade from not eating Twinkies, it's just not even recognizable. All those things are recognizable as food, and if we're not eating the things that aren't recognizable as food, then we've got to be pleased with ourselves. So I would just try getting the best grass-fed restaurant you can, dry aging in a restaurant you can, and make your decision based on that, and then you can see whether to pursue it.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do. Now, I don't know when that's going to happen, since our fine restaurants are not operating the same way.
No.
I've been to Fogo de Chao, and that was really awesome, but different. I have been to a couple of fine Italian steakhouses in the past, but I don't think that I got the dry aged steaks. But I also felt like, I could probably do this better at home. I wasn't too pleased, so.
No, I think it's a question. Yeah, you got to probably find do a bit of research and find the place that everybody's really raving about, and then see what you think. But
yeah,
this is the problem: is when you start cooking really good steaks at home, and it can be disappointing when you go out. It really can. It really can, and you're paying $100 for a steak, and you're thinking, you know what, this isn't that great.
Yeah.
But this is the price we pay.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, is there anything else that we need to talk about today?
I think that we hit all the things. So what is coming next for you? Where do people go to get your book? Can they come to you with all of their questions now and share their beautiful pictures of things that they learned today and all of that?
So the best place to find me is on Instagram. I am at RUSTON'S BONEYARD, RUSTON'SBONEYARD, at RUSTON'S BONEYARD on Instagram. I have got a website, www.rustonsboneyard.com. If you go to the store on my website, you can find the Ruston's Boneyard Guide to Steak. And it's very affordable. It's a digital download. So check that out. If you have any questions about cooking, come and find me on Instagram, follow me, send me a message. I'm always happy to talk about food and cooking. You don't need to buy my book. If anybody sends me a picture of their steaks, send me a picture, tag me, message me, all that stuff. I would love to engage and talk about food anytime.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And so everybody who's watching, definitely, when you tag him with your pictures, tag me too, because I definitely want to see the successes and, all of the beautiful creations that you all make. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week, and have a great one. All right.
Thank you so much, Ada. I really appreciate being given this opportunity to come and talk to you. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you.
You're welcome.